Hope you're having a good evening. I don't know how you feel about pruning, but I used to feel like this cartoon lady in the middle of my slide, trapped between a pruning saw and some pruning shears. Um, I became a master gardener, but we didn't really learn a whole lot about pruning. And I thought, I'll volunteer to give a talk. And that worked. So it's my pleasure tonight to share your time with you and hopefully you learn some things. Well, plants have been around for a long time, longer than we have, and they've done just fine without us. So why do we prune? Well, we live around them now. There are lots and lots of us, and we see plants. Probably everybody sees plants every day. So it's a human thing. First and foremost is for our safety. Secondly, we want to enrich our lives with healthy plants. And I think anybody who does any gardening or even just sits in a park can appreciate that. Are the fruit or the flowers of this plant important to me? Is the appearance of this plant important to me? Safety is first and foremost. And I think you can see in 3 of these photos what the safety issue is. The one in the upper left is a tree branch hanging precariously over a roof. Lower left, a tree is impacting on some power lines. Lower right, this bush is blocking a sidewalk and the lady has to walk out on the street. And then this 4th photo, it may not be obvious what the safety issue is here, but you see this sharp angle. Both of these branches are trying to be the trunk. We call these codominant leaders. And the problem with them may be a little easier to see in this diagram. Here, they're not quite so far apart. So they've been able to form something called the bark branch ridge, and they're held together pretty well at the junction. Here is a much more acute angle. And what happens is the bark becomes inclusion, forms an inclusion. And there's no strength here. As you know, you can peel bark off. So the only thing holding these branches to the trunk are the heartwood down here. So if there's a strong wind, one of these will be prone to snap off. And I'll talk some more about this later. Second, we want to enrich our lives with healthy plants. We like for them to look nice and provide shade. They need airflow. So it's nice not to have a overgrown plant. Sunshine, same problem. If the plant's overgrown, it can't get to all the leaves to nourish the plant. It can cause too much mechanical stress and the branches can snap and damage the tree, which can stress the tree, as well as be an entry point for pests and diseases. We like to renew them so they keep looking good. Are the flowers or the fruit on this plant important to me? You can prune in order to regulate fruit bearing and make your harvest easier and the fruit tastier. And then you can encourage flowering. You can deadhead your flowers and cut them back when they're finished flowering to invigorate the plant. Finally, is this plant's appearance important to me? And you can see in one of these photos, it's a fairly formal garden. This requires some work to keep it looking good. You can have low-lying rocks with some flowers spilling over them. You could have a less formal garden with some native plants, perhaps. And you can go pretty crazy with the appearance. These were obviously trained when they were young and the branches were flexible. I don't know where this is. I wish I did. I'd love to go see it. This is really important because this will help reduce your stress. And I don't know about you, but the older I get, the less well my memory works. And I just don't remember what the plant did last year. So and I also have a very bad habit for going into a nursery and buying stuff before I see if I even have a place for it in my garden. So research the plant you think you want. Find out what can grow in the spaces where you want to grow things. And researching has never been easier with the internet. I'm sure most of you remember the dark days of Netscape and computers being incredibly slow. Take photos. It's so easy now with these high resolution phone cameras to take a photo, and it really gives you a lot of information. You can make file folders either electronically or with paper to keep track of your findings. Print the photo and stick it in the file. You can label branches also, and I'll explain why this can be important later, but it's important to know what's old wood and what's new wood, especially if you've got fruit that plants that are fruiting or bearing or having berries. And take notes. You can note what time of year the plant may have gotten sunburned, so you can put shade cloth up the next year. You can find out when the aphids start invading. Notes are really reliable, or really, they've got your back. Again, do some research before you buy, make a plan, and keep a record. Well, how about when do you prune? You can prune almost any time on the circumstances I'm going to explain with this diagram. There are the 4 Ds: dead, diseased, damaged, and deranged. That's my own word, but most people call it deformed. So anything that's dead, the tree doesn't need, you can take that off anytime. Any part of the tree that's diseased, you can take off anytime. But if you're going to do more pruning, be sure to sanitize your tools before you use them on a healthy part of the tree. Damaged, this isn't doing the tree any good, so you can cut this off. And then deranged, things like crossing branches or branches that are too close to the ground, things that are too crowded or just not growing the way you'd like. So dead, diseased, damaged, and deranged. You can also get rid of competing, crowded, and downgoing branches if your tree is vigorous. It won't miss all of those. And then there are a couple of things called water sprouts and root suckers. Most plants, in particular roses and fruit trees, are grafted, and you'll see often see a bulge where the graft union is, the graft junction. And anything that's growing below the graft junction is coming from the rootstock. Rootstock tends to be very hardy and disease resistant, but at the expense of beauty or good fruiting. So, you don't want these root suckers stealing nutrients from the part of the tree above the graft junction, that's the productive part. And then water sprouts, once you get the idea, you'll recognize them pretty easily. They're kind of spindly, they grow straight up from the next largest branch. They're not very productive, and they're weak. And a lot of times they're in the center, so you can get rid of those just about any time. So dead, diseased, damaged, deranged, water sprouts, and root suckers, you can get rid of just about any time. Here are some photos of water sprouts and root suckers. Even though this tree it looks like it was pruned properly, the branch was taken all the way back to the trunk, and I'll talk about that more later. There are these little whips that come out that aren't strong or productive, and they're unsightly. And I'll explain why this happens later on. Down here's another photo of these water sprouts. You can see they're coming straight up and they're spindly. And then this is a little hard to see. These are my roses, and here's the graft junction. There's a little bulge here, and then anything coming out from below it, you can see some of these root suckers have started leafing out. You can cut all of those off, cut them back as far as you can down to the root. You may have to dig in the soil a little bit. And they're going to come back, but it's best to keep them under control, especially if your plant is going to be growing soon. And then this is a rose in the front of my house. I don't know what happened to it. It was like this when I bought the house, but the whole nice productive part of it has died, and all you get is root suckers. And I left it and I let it flower, and the flowers, they're not particularly beautiful and they don't smell good, but it's kind of hard to get rid of a plant. So I've got the graft junction circled there. Why do you prune during dormancy? That seems to be when most people are concerned about pruning. And the dormant season is coming up. The leaves are falling, plants are starting to quiet their development down for the winter. Well, the structure is visible because the plant has lost its leaves. It's less stressful for the plant because it's dormant. And the root nutrients and energy will be directed to the buds that you leave. And just a word to the wise, some California natives may be dormant in the summer because that's how they adapt to our long, hot summers, long, dry summers. This is a photo of a summertime, it's a buckeye tree, and that's a native plant. They have lovely leaves and beautiful fragrant flowers, nice tall white flower spikes in the spring. And then they all fall, they all drop, and they look like they're dead. These are the seed pods here. So this tree looks unsightly. I like having them back in the yard just because I like the flowers a lot. But this is when you would prune this tree. Now, what about pruning during the growing season? The growing season for most plants is the early summer, and you prune during the growing season to slow down overly vigorous plants because it's going to take away all those nice little solar panels that we call leaves, and the plant won't get as much nourishment, so it's going to slow it down. You do it to reduce the size of plants. So if you've got a tree that's too big and you can see the shape pretty well, it's a good time to prune oversized trees. You also may need to prune to unload heavy branches. And as you can see on the right, this is an apricot tree. There are lots of fruit on this branch. The branch really can't support this much fruit. And it's hard to do, but you really should thin it out. This not only keeps the branch from getting too weighted down, but the fruit will be better because the tree doesn't have as many to nourish. And the time to do this is when it's the fruit's about golf ball sized or a little bit smaller. And this down here is a garden that looks pretty overgrown to me. So during the growing season is when you might want to cut this garden back. And just a word about pruning during the spring and summer. Be mindful of nesting birds. You might want to wait till they've fledged. And a general guideline is to remove 1/3 of a growing plant at the most. If your plant's especially vigorous, you can fudge on this a little bit, but this is a pretty good guideline. So here's a slide. This is important. I'm going to repeat it. Prune during the growing season to reduce the plant size. Prune during the dormant season to shape and invigorate. What happens is, as I said, when the leaves are gone, you can shape the plant much more easily, and it will invigorate them because the plant that you have left, there's a great big bunch of roots that was nourishing that big plant before you cut it back. And so what's left is going to get a real boost. Well, when should you not prune? You shouldn't prune when energy is flowing through the plant. In the fall, The energy is coming out of the leaves when they're turning these beautiful colors and going down into the roots. So you don't want to be disrupting that energy flow. Also, if you prune late in the season, you can get a late flush. A late flush is a sudden stimulation of growth of the plant, and they're young and tender shoots, and they're prone to freezing. And that stresses the plant. You also don't want to prune when the energy is flowing the other way. The energy is coming out of the roots and going into the growing plant when it's making its shoots and buds. And you probably shouldn't make any major cuts during the growing season, except for dead wood or diseased wood. And you also shouldn't prune when you should call a certified arborist. And I don't remember if the reference is in the handout, but you can find a certified arborist by Googling www.treesaregood.org. Trees are good, no spaces, and it's all lower caps. www.treesaregood.org. And there are a lot of scammers out there, so you don't want to get a guy that just shows up with his truck because it's convenient. You want to make sure that they're certified. Well, when should you call a certified arborist? Probably when the branch diameter is over 4 inches, especially if it's high up. You might want to think twice if the branch diameter is 2 to 4 inches. If you're experienced and the branch is low and it's not in danger of hurting anything, you might be able to handle it. I have a Sawzall, which is like a power pruner. It isn't as clean as one of those nice little pruning saws, but when it's a big branch, it is very handy, especially if the branch is already off the tree and you need to cut it into parts that can be carried out to be disposed of. You also should probably think twice if you need a ladder. I don't know about you, but the older I get, the worse my balance gets. And I was a pretty good tree climber when I was 5, but I'm losing it. So remember, safety first. How do you prune? A lot of people get kind of confused about this, but it's really pretty straightforward. We already talked about the things you can prune anytime. Here's a photo. Here's a picture of that diagram again. These are rose stems on the right. The idea with pruning is that you want to develop lateral branches, the branches that you leave, because the energy that was going above this little bud here is going to be directed to that bud, but you have to cut it in the right place. This is a little too high. You can see these are all cut at an angle, which is good. You want to cut them at an angle because otherwise rainwater will pool on the top and it could putrefy what's left. It could attract fungus and insects. And this is a little too big to heal properly. This cut is too low because it may be crushing the cambium or the vascular tissue that's going out to this lateral branch. The cambium in most plants is all around the outside and it carries water and nutrients to the rest of the tree. This cut's about right. This is about 1/4 of an inch from this lateral bud. And you may get a few little shoots here, but in general, the energy will be mostly directed to this lateral bud. Well, when I learned that there were only 2 types of pruning cuts, I thought there was hope for me to learn how to do this. The 2 types of cuts are called heading cuts or removal cuts. Heading cuts are also called tipping or topping. And that's when you cut a branch or a stem any old place, usually in between the nodes. The nodes are the places where things grow. And removal cuts are also called thinning or reduction cuts. And there's a special case of a removal cut called a 1-2-3 cut. And this will make sense in a minute. A removal cut, you take the branch all the way back to the trunk or to the next biggest branch. A reduction cut is the same thing as a removal cut, except you're removing a smaller part of the branch. So this part of the branch is smaller than this one. I'm sorry. Sorry, that's very confusing. I just figured this out, so bear with me. But the reduction cut, you're taking this branch, which is bigger than the one you're leaving. So with a removal cut, you're taking the cut all the way back to the next biggest branch or trunk. With a reduction cut, you're taking a bigger branch back to the next branch, which is generally smaller. And then the heading cut is out here in between the growing places, the nodes. Here's another illustration of the two basic cuts. On the left are removal and reduction cuts. Here's before. You can kind of see that these are grayed out, and these are what you're getting rid of. And you can see you're taking them all the way back to the next sized branch. And you end up with a nice, open, tidier looking shrub. Heading cuts, you're cutting in between the growing areas, in between the nodes. You're kind of giving it a haircut. And when you do that, hair is what you get. So you get all this bushy growth. And it doesn't look very good on most trees. Now, if you have a shrub or a hedge, you may want this bushy growth. So there is some utility, but for trees, by and large, you do removal and reduction cuts. This is a very useful slide. I'm not going to go through the whole thing in the interest of time, but I wanted to include it in your references. This is from the Vacaville Tree Foundation. And these are 5 steps for shaping young ornamental trees. We've talked about the first one, which is removing broken, diseased, dying, or dead branches. And the rest of this you can look at after you fill out the evaluation. And then here's the, if you want to look at the whole reference, there's the website down there, web link. Well, how do you prune an older tree? That was the third most common concern of in our poll. Safety first. So if it's a really big branch or it's really high up, you may need to call a certified arborist. The idea with pruning on these trees with big branches and trunks, you want to preserve the branch collar and the bark branch ridge. And if you look at trees, you can see this subtle dark area, which is the bark branch ridge, and you'll see a subtle swelling, which is the branch collar. This is a special area of the tree. These contain cells that will go in and heal over the cut that you make. So if you cut out too far, these cells can't get out to the stump. If you cut back too close to the trunk, you'll damage those cells and they can't heal. And in general, you should not use sealant over the cut. It doesn't exactly make sense, but studies have shown that you seal bad things in more than you keep bad things out. Although apparently this is being studied again, so the jury is out. But in the meantime, UC recommends that you do not use sealant over the cut. This is a 1-2-3 cut or a jump cut. This is a special case of a reduction cut. This is so that what you're leaving doesn't get torn by this big heavy branch. So you don't want to cut at spot 3 first, because after you go through part of the branch, it could tear the remaining vascular tissue and tear into the cut that you've made. And that stresses the tree and it provides more surface area for disease and insects to get in. So what you want to do is make a cut at 1, which is on the underside of this big branch. Then you want to make a cut at 2. So what that does is it controls the the way this branch will fall, and it won't tear anything out on what you're going to leave. And then your final cut would be at C and D, which is, probably an inch or less away from the branch collar and the bark branch ridge. Again, you don't want to cut at G and H because that's on the wrong side of this branch collar. You'll cut it off and this big wound won't heal. So here are some ways you should not prune. Here's what happens when you don't use the 1, 2, 3 cut. You can see there's been a lot of tear out and damage to the remaining vascular tissue. This is a flush cut. It's cut too close to the trunk and it's damaged the branch collar and the bark branch ridge, so this can't heal. And this is a birch tree from my property. I didn't prune it, but they cut too far away from the branch collar and the bark branch ridge, and this tree is dying. None of this could heal, and a fungus got in, and the tree is rotting from the inside. Again, how not to prune. This was a heading cut. You can see that the branch was cut too far away from the next biggest branch, and it's getting all this spindly growth stimulated, which steals nutrients, isn't productive, and doesn't look very attractive. Now here's a reduction cut, but this branch is at kind of an acute angle relative to the trunk. And this is a little bit where the art of pruning comes in. If you cut parallel to the branch collar and the bark branch ridge, you're going to leave a pretty big wound. And down here, the branch collar and the bark branch ridge have ended. And this is an entry spot for disease and pests. So you kind of have to compromise. Again, you do want to make an angle cut because you don't want water pooling on this. But I would cut on the red line instead. And then you're making a much smaller wound than if you cut parallel here. And you can kind of cross your fingers and hope that this part of the branch collar and the bark branch ridge, those cells will get down to heal that wound. Here are some diagrams, and I really want to stress this. So this is a little repetitive. More on how not to prune. So here's a deciduous tree that's been topped. You may recall that topping and tipping are the same thing as heading cuts. It's just been mowed. I'm pretty sure that this is where the guy's hedge trimmer could reach. So that's why the guy or gal, whoever pruned the tree, that's where it reaches. So that's where they mowed. And what you end up a year later is with all this spindly growth. It's not very strong or productive. 3 years later, it's even more bushy, and it just doesn't look like a tree. It starves the tree temporarily because the tree is busy trying to nourish all these branches, and it weakens the tree because they're all so spindly. And then all these cuts are a lot of entry places for the elements and pests and disease. And you're worse off later because none of these are very strong branches. And again, it's okay for shrubs if you want the bushiness. And here's a topped conifer. I'm sure you see a lot of these just because we're living among trees. We've got these beautiful redwoods and other big trees, and they're running into the power lines. And it's kind of a shame that they've been cut like this. But you can see this was topped because there's some trunk left. I actually have a neighbor who topped his redwood tree because it was running into power lines, and he took this center cut all the way back to the lateral branches, and he keeps it pruned, and it looks kind of like a shrub. It really doesn't look too bad. It's kind of looks like a hedge, I should say. So if you want to do it, you can give it a try. It is a really difficult problem, and it's a shame to see trees like this. I don't really have time to talk about pollarding and coppicing unless somebody has a question about it. These are exceptions. They are heading cuts done to trees, and there are some trees that can tolerate it and don't look too bad. Okay, finally, we get to why the tree does this. Why does this different growth happen? Well, there's something that's called apical dominance. Apical dominance is the growth of the bud at the top of a stem. And having this bud at the top of the stem, there are different chemicals or hormones that suppress the growth of other buds. So this one will grow. You can see examples of it over here. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So if you cut here, you're going to get all this spindly growth. If you cut down here, closer to the lateral branch or bud, you don't have growth centers that will produce that spindly growth. They've been cut off. So you end up, the nutrients and water end up developing this lateral branch. So I'm going to talk again about how to prune an older, i.e. big tree with reduction cuts. You can either do an open center, and this is very commonly done for fruit trees because it lets in a lot of air and light, and the more light you get, the better your fruit will be. And lateral branches tend to have the best fruit, as it turns out. So if you visit our garden, you'll see a lot of open centers on our fruit trees. Here's a central leader, but this tree has been pruned because these branches are very nicely spaced. Palm fruits, apple and pear, tend to like growing with a central leader. So you'll see a lot of commercial growers having a central leader. And then you can do a modified central leader if your tree is getting too tall. So you can do a reduction cut of the tall part down to the next lateral branch. If you do this with a conifer, it's going to look drunk, but for a deciduous tree, it doesn't look too bad. This will fill in with some leaves. So this reduction cut over here, schematically, it's a reduction rather than a removal cut, which are just two variations of the same thing. You're taking the trunk all the way back to this big lateral branch. You're cutting parallel to the bark branch ridge. Again, here's where the art comes in. If you're going to have to cut too far down and make a really big wound where it might not heal, then you may have to make an angle cut at a little less acute angle. But you don't want to cut straight across because water will pool there. Here's another example of how to prune an older tree. This one you can see has two codominant leaders. They're both trying to be the trunk, and it doesn't look nice. And then you've got this very acute angle down here where one of these branches could snap off in a heavy wind. This tree probably needs a certified arborist. It's going to probably have to be pruned in stages because taking all this stuff off at once may stress the tree too much. So part of the biggest codominant leader is coming off at first, this part here. The next part, which could be later in the season or the next season, you take off the rest of it. The following season, there's another codominant leader in here. It's a little hard to see. You take that one off. And then afterwards, you've got a very nicely shaped tree. It's smaller, and the dangerous branches are gone. Here's another older tree. Now, this tree, I would say, needs a certified arborist. I don't exactly know how big these are, but you can see they're very close together, the very acute angle, and all of this bark inclusion has no strength at all. So again, the shallow angle of this branch union is weak and will be more prone to breaking. Here's the bark that's included, and it's just this small amount of wood down here that's providing the strength for that big branch. Well, this would be a good time to do a new paragraph and talk about tools. It's important to have the proper tools to prune. The handheld pruners here will be the ones that you most commonly use. And it's worth spending a little money on those, as my husband used to say, you only cry once. So you may have to spend, usually they're under $100, but you may have to spend $40, $50, or $60. And some brands will have different sizes of these, which is really nice if you've got big or small hands. These loppers are really nice for bigger branches. I love my loppers. You get a lot more strength behind the cut because you've got longer lever arms here. You can use shears. You can use shears for grasses and hedges, or a hedge trimmer if they're big. Pruning saw, these work surprisingly well, and they're not very expensive. They're great for making nice clean cuts on bigger branches. And then there's an anvil pruner. I'm sorry, this is the anvil pruner down here. Pruning saws also come in big sizes, and usually they have pruners at the end as well, so you can get smaller branches that are up high. And these work surprisingly well also. And then down here is an anvil pruner. The difference between, see, these here are called bypass shears because these blades scissor. There's really only one blade, but they scissor. This one blade crushes the branch, and it's okay to use for stuff that's not on the tree that you're not going to keep. So for dead, diseased, etc., or root stock, you can use these to cut, but it will crush the cambium. So I wouldn't use it on part of the plant that you care about. It's not hard to take care of the tools, and winter time's always a good time to do it because usually the garden is you're not very busy then. You can use a wire brush or steel wool for buildup, turpentine to clean off pitch and sap. It's important to sanitize your tools, and you should do it at least once a year, and more frequently if you've got some diseased plants. And you should do it in between each cut if you're going from the diseased part to the healthy part. It would make more sense to me to leave the diseased parts for last. And you can use alcohol, 60 or 70% alcohol, which is pretty quick and easy, or you can make a 10% bleach solution to sanitize. And that's what I use if I'm going to reuse pots. I'll just fill a big bin with 10% bleach solution. You mix 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. And then I'll dip and spin the pots in it and let them dry and then rinse them off. You should have a sharpening system, and these can be cheap and they're easy to use. Most hardware stores and nurseries will have a little carbide sharpener that you can use. You want to maintain the bevel, and you can buy sharpening systems now that have the bevel built in, which is really nice. This photo has quarters, which shows you approximately the angle that you want, so you maintain the bevel on the cutting edge. And then after you sharpen the cutting edge, and this edge does not cross the other edge, it's on the outside. And the reason for that is that if you sharpen the inside where there is no bevel, you're going to lose metal, and then you won't get a nice clean cut. And then afterwards, you want a deburring. Usually the sharpeners come with a deburring stone also, and you just want to make a couple of quick passes to get rid of the little burrs that you might have lifted up when you were sharpening, because otherwise they can tear the plant that you leave. You can use just about any kind of oil to prevent corrosion, and especially if you live in a humid place. If you're going to keep them outside, they should really be in an enclosed area, and you want to oil them. And make sure, see, that's just showing you where the bevel is. That's showing you where you deburr. And this shows you where the connecting screw is. The first time I sharpened my pruners, I was going out to prune my roses, and I was very pleased with myself. That had a nice sharp edge. And the cuts were just awful. It was crushing my stems. And then I realized that this connecting screw was loose. So make sure that connecting screw is tighter. It doesn't matter how sharp your pruners are, you won't get nice cuts. Be sure to stay safe. I recommend safety glasses. Prescription glasses really won't keep things from flying in from the side, and I have had that happen, even just pruning shrubs. Get a pair of good gardening gloves. I have about 2 or 3 different types depending on the plant. In the summertime, you'll want a hat, sunscreen, and be sure to stay hydrated. Us older folks are very often on high blood pressure medication, and I could not believe how dizzy I get, even when I'm just a couple of cups low on water. So be sure to stay hydrated, keep the water bottle handy. And then use long sleeves if you need them. Plants have to protect themselves, and every time I prune my squash, cucurbits, or squash families in the cucurbit family, or my tomatoes, I get an itchy rash on my arms. It's not dangerous. It's just more of an irritation. But I wear long sleeves. If I forget, then I rinse my arms with very cold water, which helps stop the itching and the irritation, and use some soap to get rid of whatever the chemical was that the plant put on me. Well, how do you prune and shape a young fruit tree? There is one time when you make a heading cut, and that's when you get a bare root tree from the nursery. They should be available coming up pretty quickly because they're cheaper, and they're easier to handle. And you will be surprised if you take good care of this little stick with its root ball. You'll be surprised how big and beautiful a tree you can get from it. But most of us UC Master Gardeners recommend for home gardeners, you don't need a big tree. They're messy. You can't cover them to protect them from squirrels or birds. And it's really hard to harvest the fruit. So I couldn't make this cut with my first tree. It grew, and it waited for me till the next winter, and then I cut it down to about knee level. It's really a hard cut to make, and a lot of nurseries will do it for you. So you leave about 12 to 36 inches of stem or this little trunk left. Make sure you are cutting well above and planting well above the graft junction. And then it will grow some branches going out to the side. And that's what you want. This heading cut will stimulate branching, but when you're starting with a stick, you want some branches. When your fruit tree gets a little bigger, and it will with proper care, you want to space out the branches so they're not crowded. And you may want to get a branch spreader because it will reduce the crowding. You'll get more light and air inside, and the fruit will be better. The fruit's better on lateral branches. You can make your own by cutting notches in wood stakes, or you can get plastic branch spreaders online, or you can weigh the branches down with string and some weights. And then you want to do some radial spacing and vertical spacing. So you want 12 to 15 inches in between the vertical branches, and you want to space the branches evenly around the tree. Now, if you're going to espalier, or if the tree is next to a fence, obviously you can't have a branch going all the way around. You may have to remove a couple of them. Remember, this is important. Lateral branches bear lots of fruit, so that's what you want to promote. Well, where is the fruit going to come from? And this was always the part that scared me. There are people who just seem to have known this from birth. But I'm giving you references so you can know where to look this up. Where is the fruit going to come from? Is it going to come from the most recent growth? Well, how do you tell if this is most recent? Well, it'll be at the end of the stem. And also you can see terminal bud scales and scars. This is last year's growth because it's got some scarring, and these lenticels are prominent. Lenticels are pores for air exchange in the stem. Here's another example. There's a leaf scar and a bud scar. And here are these nodes. This is where the fruit and flowers will come from. So the thing you have to ask, which is really important, will the flowers or fruit come from new wood, which is the current season's growth, or from old wood, which is last season? If you have to wait for the fruit to come from old wood, you don't want to be cutting it off. And if you have to wait for fruit to come from new wood, you don't want to be cutting off the new part. Will the fruit come from the tip or from spurs? And I'll show you what a spur is in a minute. This is from a really great PowerPoint presentation, and I don't have a link for it, but you can type in, I think I've got the PDF, you can copy and paste it from your references. Advanced Techniques for Small Orchards, UCANR 2011, University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, UCANR 2011. It's a great PowerPoint presentation. So you need to be able to recognize fruiting wood and fruit buds from vegetative wood and shoot buds. You don't want to be cutting off all the fruiting wood. These are all from a peach. It's a stone fruit. Compound buds are characteristic of stone fruit. And what a compound bud is the leaves and the buds all come from the same area. So you can see this flat vegetative bud being flanked by two rounded flower buds. And this 1-year-old shoot in a peach will only produce fruit for the current year. So after this branch is fruited, it's not going to fruit again. You can cut it back to a lateral bud during dormancy, and that will be the new shoot that the fruit will come from. This is an apple. Apples are in the palm family. They're different. This is a spur. It's kind of a hefty little branch, short, that comes off the bigger branch. And this is where the fruit will come from. And apple spurs will produce for up to 10 years. So you don't want to be cutting these off after they've fruited. You want to leave them because they're going to fruit for years. And you can see that there's a little rosette. There's a whole bunch of them. And you'll, with a little bit of luck and not too much wind and some pollination, you'll get fruit growing from all of those. On this slide are 3 different fruits. This is an Asian pear. Pear is in the palm family, like the apple, so it will set fruit on spurs. We don't want to cut these off. This is an apricot. Apricots are kind of cool because the buds are bright pink and they're easy to identify. This is in the stone fruit family. So here are the shoot buds. That's what they look like. They're greener. And once this is fruited, you can cut it off when it comes time to prune because it's not going to fruit again. And figs are kind of interesting because you'll get figs. Those of you who have fig trees, you know that the fruit comes right off the stem. It doesn't seem to have a spur, and it's not a compound bud. The shoots and the buds and the shoots are from different parts of the stem. This is a very useful table. I can't look all this stuff up and I can't keep it in my head. I'm sorry, I can look it up, but I can't keep it all in my head. So this is in your references. On the left side of this table are the type of tree. At the top, it tells you the location of the fruiting buds, how long the spurs last, if it has spurs, the type of training system that's typically used, and the amount of pruning that you want to do on the mature trees. Very useful table. This is the only time I'm going to see. Someone has a question? Okay, let's see. I'm looking for Gretchen. I think this is one that the questioners want me to answer now. Let's see where Gretchen is. Going through everybody. I don't see her listed. So we'll have to deal with that question later.
I think we can keep going, Anne, and just handle the
Okay.
questions when you get to
Okay.
your question period.
Okay. This is the only time I'm going to talk about disease, and that's because of something called the Eutypa fungus. Apricots, grapes, and cherries are very prone to this fungus, which is active during wet weather. So you want to make sure you've got at least 1 to 2 weeks of dry weather before you prune apricots, grapes, and cherries. And this goes for apricot hybrids such as apriums and pluots. This is a canker from the fungus underneath the bark at a pruning wound. You'll see rough, dark bark like you see on this apricot branch. And then this grape limb has very stunted foliage due to dieback from the fungus. Well, what about hedges? Not all hedges and shrubs need to be pruned, especially if you like a natural look. If you want a formal look, you'll want your hedges to look nice, especially if they're going to be a barrier for you. So you've got to prune them like a trapezoid. So the upper part needs to be pruned back a little more than the lower part. And the reason for that is that these lower branches need sunshine. And you can remove the oldest wood on hedges to rejuvenate them. And follow the basic pruning principles: dead, diseased, damaged, or deranged. Well, what about grapevines? There's a guy named Chuck Ingles, Ingels, who has done talks. He's got a Master Gardener YouTube video all about grapevines and how to prune them. It's excellent. Chuck Ingles, Ingels. You can type his, I'm sorry, I found this out. I didn't have it in time to put in your references, but if you put his name in and then UCANR, his video should pop up. Well, as far as grapevines go, I'm not an expert, but I know it's important to know where your variety of grape sets fruit. Is it at the base or is it further out? And I know that wine grapes are different from table grapes. You want to prune off the spindly canes, and the fruit is on the new season's shoots from the 1-year-old canes, which are those lateral branches that grew the prior season. What about citrus? Citrus is pretty forgiving. It's an evergreen, so you can prune it and shape it almost any time. And usually a hard prune is not needed unless you want to do something special with it. You can always do the 4 Ds: dead, diseased, damaged, and deranged. You can always do water sprouts and suckers, and citrus does get water sprouts. And you want to keep the branches off the ground, as I mentioned earlier, so pests and disease don't get in. You can espalier them. You can make a hedge out of them, and they'll still produce fruit. What about cane plants? Again, it depends. That depends on the species and the variety. And I have read, I believe, that there are 2 different blackberry varieties, and I think you have to prune them differently. So you really need to know which variety you have. In general, you cut off all the old canes after they've produced. And there's a great book that you can get through the University of California A&R book list. What about roses? There is what they call a 1/3, 2/3 rule for modern shrub roses. You remove 1/3 of the very oldest canes. This keeps the plant from becoming an overgrown thicket of poor flowering canes, so roses do get tired. Then you replace these canes by identifying about 1/3 of the new canes, and you cut all the others off. So you pick 1/3 of the canes that you want to keep. And in general, we like to make roses vase-shaped for air circulation and sunshine. So you'd cut back an old cane to a lateral branch and cut back. So you take 1/3 of the old canes away and 2/3 of the new canes. So you identify the new canes that you want to keep. You can remove the root suckers anytime. And you can remove the spent blooms during the growing season to encourage reblooming. Roses make rose hips, which some people like for the vitamin C, but they take a lot of energy. So if you don't if you don't deadhead your roses, it's going to really impact flowering. And here I'm just showing the cuts that you want to make again. What about different rose varieties? Identify where the graft junction is, and you can get rid of the root suckers below that. How long you make the remaining canes is really up to you. It depends on how long, your trellis or your pergola is, if you've got a climber or a rambler. And you can grow them to shape. So if you have rose trees, you'd probably want to cut off all the little branches, do removal cuts down here on the long stem, and then do the standard 1/3, 2/3 rule for the upper part, your rose trees. What about California native plants? It depends on the species. Generally, they don't need much pruning, and usually people, if they're planting native plants, they like to have a natural look. Calscape.org is a fantastic website. It has loads of photos. It's got great filters, so you can put in, where you're going to plant in the sun or the shade. What color do you want? Do you want a bush or a tree? It's a great website. And they tell you how to prune too. Most people don't like to prune much, again, to preserve the ecosystem because it's food and shelter for a lot of our native animals. And there are some species of native plants that you probably shouldn't prune at all, such as madrone trees or manzanitas, because once you've lost that branch, it won't grow back. And madrone trees grow very slowly. What about ornamental grasses? Well, a power hedge trimmer is great if you've got a big hedge, or if it's small and not too beefy, you can use garden shears. You can cut them way back. They can also be divided, and it's best done when the growth is slow. So you can just divide it right in half and take the roots with the portion of the plant where you've divided. And then you can use a rake to remove the dead blades. So it was a lot of material we covered. I'm sure you've got some more questions, but I want to summarize now. Stay focused on the whole plant, relax, plan, do some research before you go buy your plants. Remember the 4 Ds, suckers and water sprouts. You can prune those off anytime. There are only 2 types of cuts: header cuts, also called tipping and topping, and removal cuts, also called reduction or thinning cuts. Prune when dormant, to invigorate your plant and to shape it. Prune when plant is growing, to control the size. take care of your tools, and take care of yourself. And know when to call a certified arborist.